The morning light filtered through the kitchen blinds the same way it had for 37 years, cutting golden strips across the oak table Linda had picked out when we were still young enough to believe furniture was forever. I sat in my usual chair, the one on the left, facing the window, with the blue ceramic mug that had a chip on the handle from the time Michael knocked it off the counter when he was 12. Linda had refused to throw it away. Character marks, she'd called them, running her thumb over the rough edge the way she did with everything imperfect that still had use left in it. The coffee was black, strong enough to wake the dead. At 71, I'd learned that some pleasures shouldn't be diluted. The morning routine was simple. Coffee, by 6, scan the headlines of the Post-Standard, check the weather, and listen to the house settle into another day. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked its steady rhythm, the same one Linda had insisted we buy at that estate sale in Geneva 25 years ago. I'd thought it was too expensive then. She'd been right about its beauty. She usually was. On the refrigerator, held by a magnetic clip shaped like a cardinal, hung our wedding photo from 1974. Linda in her grandmother's dress, me in a rented tux that pulled at the shoulders. We looked impossibly young, impossibly certain that love was enough to carry us through whatever came next. Below that, Michael's college graduation photo, cap slightly askew, that grin that used to light up rooms. 26 years old then, full of plans and promises. Before Sarah. Before the silence that stretched between us now like a frozen lake you're afraid to walk across. The house felt too quiet these days. Not empty. I'd never call it empty with Linda's presence still woven into every corner. But quiet in a way that made you notice sounds you'd never heard before. The hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the grandfather clock, the creak of floorboards that remembered the weight of 2 people instead of 1. I was reaching for the sugar bowl, old habits, even though the doctor said I should cut back, when the doorbell chimed. 7:30 in the morning, too early for the mailman, too late for emergencies. I walked to the front door, my knees protesting the stairs the way they had for the past few years, and peered through the frosted glass panel. A delivery truck sat in the driveway, engine idling. The driver held a package, not the usual brown cardboard Amazon box, but something wrapped in cream-colored paper with a burgundy ribbon, the kind of presentation you see in department store windows around Christmas. "Richard Patterson?" the driver asked when I opened the door. "That's me." He handed me the package and a clipboard. "Someone paid extra for morning delivery. Must be important." I signed my name, watching his truck disappear down Lakeshore Drive before closing the door. The package was heavier than expected, substantial. My name was written on the label in printed letters, not handwriting, the kind of careful block letters you make when you don't want your penmanship recognized. In the kitchen, I set it on the table next to my cooling coffee and studied it. The paper was expensive, the kind with texture you could feel through your fingertips. The ribbon was real silk, not the synthetic stuff most people used. Whoever sent this had money to spend on presentation. Inside the outer wrapping was a wooden box, dark mahogany with brass hinges. Inside that, nestled in burgundy tissue paper, sat a bottle of whiskey that made my breath catch. Macallan 25-year-old single malt. The label was pristine, the bottle itself seeming to glow amber in the morning light. I'd seen bottles like this behind the bar at expensive restaurants, the kind where they keep them in locked cases because they cost more than most people make in a week. Beneath the bottle, an envelope, cream-colored paper to match the wrapping, my name written in the same careful block letters. Inside, a card, not a Hallmark greeting card, but the kind of heavy stock paper that whispered money and good breeding. "Dad, Sarah and I hope you'll join us for our engagement party on Saturday, November 18th, at the Westchester Country Club. Cocktails at 6, dinner at 8. We have something important to discuss about the future. We thought you might enjoy this. A little something to celebrate. Love, Michael." I read it twice, then a third time. The words didn't change, but their meaning shifted with each reading. The whiskey sat on the table like a beautiful trap, catching the light from the window. I picked up the bottle, feeling its weight, studying the label. $800, maybe more. Michael had never spent that kind of money on gifts before. Hell, for my 70th birthday last year, he'd sent a gift card to Home Depot. $50. The card bothered me more than the whiskey. Something important to discuss about the future. That wasn't the language of family celebration. That was business talk, the kind of careful phrasing lawyers used when they wanted to sound friendly while delivering bad news. I walked to the window and looked out at Clear Lake. The water was still, reflecting the morning sky like polished steel. This view had been Linda's favorite, the reason we'd bought this house in 1987 when Michael was 15, and everything seemed possible. She'd stand at this same window every morning, coffee in hand, planning her day around the weather and the light on the water. Michael knew I'd stopped drinking whiskey 3 years ago. The heart attack had changed a lot of things: my diet, my sleep, my relationship with anything stronger than beer. The doctors had been clear. Alcohol and heart medication didn't play well together. Michael had been there in the hospital room when Dr. Reeves explained the new rules, the list of things I couldn't eat or drink anymore if I wanted to see 80. So, why send whiskey now? I pulled out my phone and found Michael's contact. The last text between us was from 2 months ago. "Happy birthday, Dad. Sorry we can't make it up this year. Work is crazy." I'd responded with a thumbs up emoji because what do you say to your only child when politeness has replaced love? My thumb hovered over the call button, then moved to Google instead. I typed Sarah Morrison Westchester and waited. The results made my stomach tighten. Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, daughter of William J. Morrison, CEO of Morrison Development Group, real estate empire worth an estimated $40 million. The kind of family that owned country clubs rather than joined them. I scrolled through images of charity galas, ribbon cuttings, society page photos. Sarah was beautiful in that polished way money could buy. Straight white teeth, perfect blonde hair, clothes that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. In every photo, she looked like she was posing for a magazine spread about successful young professionals. Michael appeared in a few of the recent photos. Same suit in each one, charcoal gray, perfectly tailored. Same smile, confident, practiced, the kind that worked well at networking events. He looked prosperous. That was the word Linda would have used. Prosperous and different. Harder around the edges, like success had been carved into his features with a sharp knife. The engagement announcement was dated 6 months ago. Funny how I'd learned about my son's engagement from Google rather than him. The write-up was full of flowery language about joining 2 prominent families and carrying on traditions of community service and business excellence. Michael was described as a rising star in financial consulting with strong ties to local development projects. I set the phone down and picked up the whiskey again. The bottle felt heavier now, weighted with implications I didn't want to consider. In the reflection of the kitchen window, I could see myself holding it, an old man with white hair and skeptical eyes, standing in a house that suddenly felt less like home and more like property. Something important to discuss about the future. The grandfather clock chimed 8 times. I'd been standing there for 30 minutes, holding an $800 bottle of whiskey, and trying to decode a message that felt less like an invitation and more like a summons. Outside, a loon called across the water, its voice wild and lonely. Linda had loved that sound, said it reminded her that some things remained unchanged even when everything else shifted around them. I opened the kitchen drawer, where we'd kept the important papers, insurance documents, the deed to the house, Linda's will, my own medical records. Everything was organized the way she'd left it, tabs labeled in her careful handwriting. At the bottom of the stack, I found what I was looking for, the property tax assessment from last year. The house was worth more now than when we'd bought it, even after the 2008 crash. Lakefront property always recovered. The land alone was worth $600,000, maybe more. The number felt different new, sitting at this table with my son's invitation and his expensive gift. Not like an asset I owned, but like a problem that needed solving. I thought about Michael's apartment in Albany, the 1-bedroom place he'd been renting for 5 years, always talking about buying something bigger once he got ahead of his student loans. Sarah's family had the kind of money that could make those problems disappear overnight. I closed the file and put it back in the drawer. The whiskey caught my eye again, amber liquid that seemed to hold secrets. Linda used to say that gifts came in 2 kinds, the ones given from love and the ones given with expectations attached. The trick, she'd said, was learning to tell the difference. This bottle felt heavy with expectations. The morning was getting away from me. I had things to do, grocery shopping, an oil change for the Chevy, a phone call to my insurance agent about the winter storm damage to the back deck. Normal things, the kind that kept a man busy enough to avoid dwelling on questions that had uncomfortable answers. But first, I walked to Linda's old desk in the corner of the living room. She'd used it for paying bills and writing letters, back when people still wrote letters. The drawers were full of her things. Stationery with our address embossed at the top, stamps she'd bought in sheets and never used, pens that still worked, even though she'd been gone 3 years. In the bottom drawer, under a stack of Christmas cards she'd never sent, I found her address book, the kind with alphabetical tabs, filled with phone numbers written in her careful script. Most of the entries were crossed out now, friends who had moved away or passed on, businesses that no longer existed. But under L, I found what I was looking for: Marcus Levy, attorney at law. Marcus had handled Linda's will, helped us with the property tax appeals, dealt with the insurance company after the ice storm took down 3 trees. He was my age, maybe a little younger, with sharp eyes and the kind of mind that saw problems coming before they arrived. I dialed his number, listening to it ring while I stared out at the lake. The water had developed small white caps, wind picking up from the north, the kind that usually meant weather coming. Levy and Associates. Marcus, it's Dick Patterson. I was wondering if you had time for a consultation. Something's come up with family matters. Of course, Dick. How's Thursday afternoon? 2 o'clock? Perfect. Marcus? I paused, watching a pair of ducks land near the dock. Bring whatever paperwork you have on the house. Property deeds, tax records, all of it. Everything okay? I looked at the whiskey bottle sitting on my kitchen table, then at the invitation to discuss my future with people I barely knew. I'm not sure yet, but I want to be prepared. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet kitchen for a long time. The coffee had gone cold. The morning light had shifted angles, and somewhere across the lake, a dog was barking at something only dogs could see. The house felt different now, not just quiet, but watchful, like it was holding its breath, waiting to see what came next. I picked up the Macallan bottle one more time, feeling its weight, reading the label with its promises of age perfection and smooth finish. Then I walked to the liquor cabinet, the one Linda had insisted we install even though neither of us drank much, and set it on the top shelf, next to the bottle of bourbon I'd opened for her birthday 2 years ago and never finished. Some gifts, I was learning, were better left unopened until you understood the price of accepting them. The invitation sat on the kitchen table, cream-colored and elegant, waiting for an answer. November 18th was 3 weeks away. Plenty of time to figure out what my son wanted to discuss about my future, and more importantly, plenty of time to decide whether I was going to let him. The Westchester Country Club looked like something out of a magazine spread about old money and older traditions. Brick and ivy, circular driveway lined with perfectly trimmed boxwoods, valet parking for cars that cost more than most people's houses. I pulled up in my 15-year-old Chevy Silverado, watching the young man in the red vest try to hide his expression as he took my keys. The truck looked like a working man's vehicle among all the German sedans and luxury SUVs, which, I supposed, was exactly what it was. I'd driven down from the lake that morning, taking Route 9 through the Hudson Valley, past horse farms and antique shops and the kind of quaint towns where city people bought weekend houses. The November air was sharp, promising snow before Thanksgiving. Linda would have loved this drive, would have made me stop at every roadside stand selling late-season apples and cider donuts. Instead, I'd driven in silence, rehearsing conversations I hoped I wouldn't need to have. The suit I wore was the same one I'd bought for Linda's funeral 3 years ago. Navy blue, conservative cut, still in good shape because I rarely had occasion to wear it. The tie was one she'd picked out, burgundy with small gold diamonds. "Brings out your eyes," she'd said, though I'd never been sure what that meant. I'd shined my dress shoes and combed my hair with the same care I'd taken 47 years ago when I'd asked her father for permission to marry his daughter. Inside, the club smelled of leather and lemon polish and something else, the particular scent of money that had been accumulating for generations. Crystal chandeliers hung from coffered ceilings. Oil paintings of fox hunts and sailing ships lined the walls. The kind of place where members spoke in quiet voices about quarterly returns and charity board positions. I found the private dining room following the discreet brass signs, my footsteps muffled by Persian rugs that probably cost more than my annual property taxes. Through the doorway, I could see Michael standing near a bar that had been set up in the corner, talking to a group of people I didn't recognize. He wore a charcoal gray suit that fit him perfectly, his dark hair styled in a way that suggested regular visits to expensive barbers. When he turned and saw me, his smile was bright and immediate, the kind salesman practiced in mirrors. "Dad!" He crossed the room with his arms extended, pulling me into a hug that felt choreographed for the audience watching us. "I'm so glad you could make it. You look great." I returned the embrace, noting how he felt different, broader through the shoulders, like he'd been working out, or maybe just carrying himself differently. Success, I'd noticed, had a way of changing a man's posture. "Congratulations, son. Where's the lucky woman?" He gestured toward a group near the windows, where a blonde woman in a navy blue dress was accepting congratulations from what appeared to be half the social register. Sarah Morrison was even more beautiful in person than in the photographs, with the kind of poise that came from growing up knowing you belonged in rooms like this. She caught my eye and smiled, the polite smile reserved for people you were supposed to be nice to, but didn't necessarily need to remember. "Sarah, come meet my dad." Michaela's voice carried across the room, with the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard. She approached with the grace of a dancer, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor. Up close, I could see she was younger than I'd expected. Maybe 28, 30 at most. Her handshake was firm, her eye contact direct. But something in her expression reminded me of the way realtors looked at houses they were calculating how to flip. "Mr. Patterson, it's wonderful to finally meet you. Michael has told me so much about you." Her voice was warm, carefully modulated, with the faint trace of an accent that spoke of boarding schools and summer homes. "All good, I hope." "Of course, she laughed, a sound like wind chimes. "He says you built the most beautiful house on the lake. I'm dying to see it." Before I could respond, Michael was guiding me toward another couple who had been hovering nearby like satellites waiting for their moment to orbit closer. "Dad, I'd like you to meet Sarah's parents, William and Patricia Morrison." William Morrison looked like Central Casting's idea of a successful businessman. Silver hair perfectly styled, tan that suggested recent time in warmer climates, handshake that lingered just long enough to establish dominance without seeming aggressive. His suit probably cost more than I'd ever spent on a car. "Richard, wonderful to meet you. Michael's told us so much about the family property up north. Sounds like quite a place." Patricia Morrison was elegant in the way that required serious money to maintain, the kind of woman who probably had standing appointments at expensive salons and knew the names of everyone worth knowing in 3 counties. Her smile was warm but evaluating, like she was mentally cataloging my net worth and social connections. "Oh, you must be so proud," she said, taking my arm as if we were old friends. "A son in finance, that beautiful lake house, all that history. Family property is such a treasure, don't you think?" The way she said family property made something cold settle in my stomach, like she was discussing a stock portfolio rather than the place Linda and I had built our life together. A server appeared with champagne flutes on a silver tray. I accepted one but didn't drink, holding it instead like a prop while the conversation flowed around me. Talk of market conditions, charity galas, someone's new yacht, the challenges of finding good help these days. I nodded and smiled and felt increasingly like an actor who'd wandered into the wrong play. Michael stayed close, his hand occasionally landing on my shoulder in gestures that felt more possessive than affectionate. "Dad's quite the handyman," he told the group. "Built half that house himself, didn't you, Dad? Amazing what you can accomplish when you have the time and energy." There was something in his tone, not quite condescending, but close. The way you'd talk about a child's art project, appreciating the effort, while implying the result was charmingly amateur. "Your son's being modest," I said to the Morrisons. "I was a general contractor for 35 years. Built everything from shopping centers to custom homes. The lake house was just the one I got to keep." William's eyebrows rose slightly. "Contractor. That's honest work, hard work." The words hung in the air with the faint suggestion that honest hard work was something admirable in others, but not necessarily something you wanted in your own family tree. I'd heard that tone before, usually from people who confused inherited wealth with earned wisdom. "Dinner is served," someone announced, and we moved to a table set with more silverware than I'd known existed. Place cards and calligraphy directed us to our seats. I was positioned between Patricia Morrison and someone introduced as Judge Harrison's wife, while Michael and Sarah held court at the head of the table like young royalty. The meal was excellent and elaborate, courses I couldn't identify, wines that probably cost more per bottle than my monthly grocery budget. The conversation flowed from topics I didn't care about to people I didn't know, punctuated by toasts and laughter that felt slightly too loud, too performed. It wasn't until dessert, something involving chocolate and raspberries that looked like architectural models, that the evening's real business began. "Richard," William Morrison said, setting down his coffee cup with the deliberate care that preceded important conversations, "Michael tells us you've been managing that property on your own since Linda passed. That must be quite a responsibility." The table grew quieter, as if everyone understood we were transitioning from social pleasantries to something more substantial. I set my own cup down and met his eyes across the crystalline candlelight. "I manage fine. It's not as big as it might sound. Just a house and some land." "Oh, but lakefront property," Patricia added, her voice gentle but insistent. "The taxes alone must be significant. And the upkeep, all those repairs, the seasonal maintenance, it must be overwhelming." I looked at Michael, who was studying his dessert plate with unusual intensity. "I've been maintaining that house for 37 years. I think I can handle a few more." "Of course you can," Sarah said quickly, reaching across to touch my hand. "We're not questioning your capability. We're just concerned about you being all alone out there. What if something happened? What if you fell or had another episode?" The word hung in the air like smoke. Another episode. My heart attack from 4 years ago, reduced to a euphemism that suggested weakness, frailty, the kind of vulnerability that required management by younger, more capable hands. "I have neighbors. I have a phone. I have a security system." William leaned forward, his expression serious and paternal. "Richard, we're family now, or we will be soon. Family looks out for each other, makes sure everyone is safe and comfortable. We've been thinking, we've found some wonderful communities," Patricia interrupted, her voice brightening as if she were offering the solution to all my problems. "Active adult communities with full-service living, golf courses, social activities, medical facilities right on site. You'd love the people, all accomplished professionals, interesting conversations, none of the isolation you must feel up there." Michael finally looked up from his plate. His eyes met mine across the table, and for just a moment, I saw something flicker there. Guilt, maybe, or the memory of the boy who used to help me stack firewood and rake leaves. Then it was gone, replaced by something harder and more calculated. "Dad, we've been talking with some financial advisors," he said, his voice careful and professional, "about estate planning, asset management, that kind of thing. The lake house is your biggest asset, but it's not liquid. If you needed long-term care, or if your health, my health is fine. For now," William said gently, "but we have to think ahead. Plan for contingencies. That's what responsible families do." Sarah reached into her purse and withdrew a leather folder. "We've had some preliminary documents prepared, nothing binding, just exploring options. A family trust structure that would protect the property while ensuring you have lifetime residence rights and full medical coverage." She slid the folder across the table. The leather was soft, expensive, the kind that suggested serious money and serious intentions. Inside, I found documents with letterheads from law firms I'd seen advertised in Fortune magazine. Trust agreements, property transfers, beneficiary designations, pages of legal language that boiled down to a simple proposition. "You want me to sign my house over to you?" Michael's face flushed slightly. "It's not like that, Dad. It's estate planning. You'd still live there, still make all the decisions about your daily life. But if something happened, if you couldn't manage anymore, the property would be protected. Sarah and I would handle the business side, taxes, insurance, maintenance contracts, all the stuff that's getting harder for you to deal with." I read through the documents slowly, aware that the table had grown quiet, except for the soft clink of coffee spoons against china. The language was dense, full of whereas clauses and legal terminology, but the intent was clear. I would retain lifetime residence rights in property that would legally belong to the Patterson Family Trust, with Michael and Sarah as trustees. "This seems pretty comprehensive for a preliminary document," I said finally. William smiled, the expression of a man closing a deal he'd been working toward all evening. "We believe in being thorough. Why waste time with multiple drafts when you can get it right the first time? And if I decide I want to sell, move somewhere warmer, maybe downsize?" The question seemed to catch them off guard. Sarah and Michael exchanged a glance, quick but not quick enough. "Well," Michael said carefully, "any major decisions like that would have to be approved by the trustees, for your own protection, of course, to make sure you weren't being taken advantage of by unscrupulous people." I closed the folder and set it beside my coffee cup. The table was silent now, everyone watching me with the intensity of bidders at an auction waiting to see if their offer would be accepted. "This is a lot to consider," I said finally. "Of course it is," Patricia said warmly. "We're not asking for an answer tonight. Take your time, think it over, talk to your own attorney if that makes you more comfortable." "But not too much time," William added, with the kind of smile that wasn't quite friendly anymore. "Sarah's pregnant. We need to start making concrete plans for the future." The words hit me like cold water. Pregnant. I looked at Sarah, who was smiling with the serene confidence of a woman who held the winning card. Her hand rested on her still flat stomach in a gesture that managed to be both protective and possessive. "Congratulations," I managed. "When?" "Early summer," she said. "We're hoping to have everything settled by then. The house would be perfect for raising children. All that space, the fresh air, the lake. Children need room to grow." I thought about Michael at 8 years old, teaching him to bait hooks off our dock. At 12, helping me replace the dock planks after ice damage. At 16, bringing his first girlfriend home to meet us, nervous and proud, and certain that love would conquer all the obstacles the world might place in their way. "I'd like to be a grandfather," I said quietly. "You will be," Michael said, and for a moment his voice softened with something that might have been genuine affection. "The best grandfather. Think about it, Dad. Your grandchildren growing up in the same house where I did, learning to swim in the same lake, building the same kinds of memories." But not, I understood now, with me living there to make those memories with them. I would be the visitor, the old man allowed occasional access to the life he'd built, grateful for the privilege of seeing his own grandchildren in his own home. The evening wound down with more champagne and in promises to get together soon. Phone numbers were exchanged, social calendars consulted, plans made for future gatherings that would include me as a peripheral figure in my own family's story. I accepted hugs and handshakes and invitations to consider their generous offer, all the while feeling like I was watching someone else's life unfold in slow motion. Michael walked me to the valet stand, his arm around my shoulders in a gesture that looked affectionate from a distance but felt more like containment up close. "I know this is a lot to process," he said while we waited for my truck, "but it's the right thing to do, Dad, for everyone. You'll be taken care of, the property will be preserved, and Sarah and I can start our family without worrying about you being alone out there." "When did you stop calling it home?" I asked. He looked puzzled. "What?" "The house. You keep calling it the property. It used to be home." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, recognition, maybe, or memory. Then it was gone, replaced by the practiced patience of someone dealing with a difficult client. "It's still home, Dad. It'll always be home, but it's also an asset that needs proper management. You understand that, don't you?" The valet brought my truck, and I climbed behind the wheel without answering. The engine started with a familiar rumble that sounded louder than usual in the country club's refined atmosphere. As I pulled away, I could see Michael in the rearview mirror, standing under the portico lights with his hands in his pockets, watching me go with an expression I couldn't read. The drive home took 2 hours through darkness that seemed deeper than usual. I kept the radio off, preferring the silence that let me think through everything I'd heard, everything I'd seen, everything I'd understood without being told. By the time I pulled into my own driveway, the one I'd paved myself 20 years ago, leading to the house I'd helped design and build, I'd made my decision. But first, I sat in the truck for a few minutes, looking at the place Linda and I had created together. The porch light was on a timer, welcoming me home the way it had every night for 37 years. The windows glowed warmly, promising heat and comfort, and the particular silence of a house that knew your footsteps, your habits, your dreams. Inside, I made myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the legal documents spread before me. The language was dense, but the meaning was clear. They wanted me to sign away ownership of my life in exchange for the privilege of living in it until they decided I couldn't anymore. I thought about Michael as a boy, building snow forts in the backyard, learning to drive in the long driveway, bringing Linda flowers he'd picked from her own garden because he thought they were wild. I thought about Sarah's hand on her stomach, and William Morrison's calculating smile, and Patricia's gentle voice explaining how overwhelming my life must be. Then I picked up the phone and dialed Marcus Levy's emergency number. "Dick, everything all right? I need to see you first thing Monday morning," I said. "And Marcus, I need you to recommend the best estate planning attorney you know. Someone who specializes in keeping families from stealing houses out from under each other. There was a pause, then Marcus's voice, sharper now and fully awake. What happened tonight? I looked out the window at the lake, black water reflecting stars that seemed closer than usual, and felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't experienced since Linda's funeral. Not peace exactly, but clarity. I found out that my son thinks I'm an old fool who can't manage his own life, I said. And I decided to prove him wrong. The coffee tasted bitter that Sunday morning, or maybe it was just the aftertaste of betrayal that lingered on my tongue. I'd slept poorly, waking every few hours with fragments of conversation echoing in my head. Lifetime residence rights. Proper management? All that space. Words that sounded reasonable in a country club dining room, but felt like razor cuts in the dark hours before dawn. I sat at the kitchen table with Linda's photo album spread open before me, turning pages that chronicled 37 years of believing family meant something permanent. Here was Michael at 3, gap-toothed and grinning, standing next to the sandbox I'd built him behind the house. At 7, holding up his first fish, a bass he'd caught off our dock after sitting patiently for 2 hours while I taught him the difference between feeling a nibble and setting the hook. At 15, awkward and proud beside the 1987 Honda Civic I'd helped him buy with money he'd earned mowing neighbors' lawns. When had that boy disappeared? When had the child who used to crawl into my lap during thunderstorms become the man who looked at this house and saw assets and estate planning opportunities? The transformation hadn't been sudden. It had been gradual, the way ice forms on a lake. So slowly you don't notice until one morning you realize the water has become something solid and cold and you can't navigate anymore. College had been the beginning, perhaps. Michael studying business and finance at Syracuse, coming home for holidays with a vocabulary full of terms I didn't understand, and opinions about maximizing potential and strategic thinking. Linda had been proud of his ambition, excited that our son would have opportunities we'd never imagined for ourselves. I'd been proud too, but also puzzled by the way he looked at our life, the house, the lake, my contracting business, like it was all quaint and limiting, something to be improved rather than appreciated. After college, he'd moved to Albany, taken a job with a financial consulting firm, started wearing suits that cost more than I'd ever spent on clothes. His visits home became less frequent, his conversations more focused on his career trajectory and less on the kind of comfortable family talk that had filled our Sunday dinners for decades. Linda had made excuses. He was busy establishing himself, finding his place in the world, becoming his own man. That's what we raised him to do, she'd reminded me when I complained about missed holidays and unanswered phone calls. We raised him to be independent, to succeed, to build something bigger than what we had. But independence, I was learning, wasn't the same as abandonment. Success didn't require forgetting where you came from, and building something bigger shouldn't mean tearing down what already existed. The photo album showed the progression clearly, like a time-lapse film of gradual estrangement. Michael's college graduation, where his smile looked genuine but distant. His first job celebration dinner, where he'd spent most of the evening checking his phone. The Christmas when he'd brought his first serious girlfriend home, not Sarah, but a woman named Jennifer who'd worked in marketing and had strong opinions about the need to update our decor. Then came the photos from after Linda's diagnosis. Michael in hospital waiting rooms, looking uncomfortable in the sterile environment, checking his watch while we waited for test results. Michael at her funeral, wearing an expensive black suit and an expression that suggested he was calculating how quickly he could return to his real life. I closed the album and pushed it away. Memory was a dangerous thing when you were angry. It had a way of reshaping the past to justify the present, of turning ordinary moments into evidence of larger patterns. But the evidence was there, accumulated over years of small disappointments and gradual cooling, leading to last night's polite ambush in a country club dining room. The phone rang at 10:30. Michael's number appeared on the caller ID, and I let it go to voicemail. 2 minutes later, it rang again. Same number, same decision. On the third call, I answered. "Dad, I've been trying to reach you." "I was in the garage," I lied, because the truth, that I hadn't wanted to talk to him, seemed too raw for a Sunday morning conversation. "How are you feeling about last night? I know it was a lot to process." His voice carried the careful modulation of someone managing a potentially difficult client. patient but purposeful, like a therapist guiding a session toward a predetermined conclusion. It was certainly educational, I said. A pause. What do you mean by that? I mean I learned some interesting things about my future, according to people I barely know. Another pause, longer this time. Dad, we're not strangers. We're family. Sarah's going to be family too, and her parents. They're good people, successful people who know how to handle complex financial situations. Complex financial situations. I repeated the phrase slowly. Is that what my life has become? Your life is exactly what it's always been, he said, his tone sharpening slightly. We're just trying to make sure it stays that way, that you're protected, that you don't have to worry about things that are getting harder to manage. What things are getting harder for me to manage, Michael? The question seemed to catch him off guard. I could hear him breathing, could almost see him searching for the right words to explain my inadequacies without sounding directly insulting. The taxes, for one thing. Property taxes on lakefront land are going up every year. The maintenance. That house is almost 40 years old, Dad. The roof, the septic system, the dock. When's the last time you had the foundation inspected? And winter's coming. What if the heating system fails? What if you fall on the ice? Each question felt like a small accusation, building a case for my incompetence that I was supposed to accept gratefully. The subtext was clear. I was old, vulnerable, incapable of managing the complexities of my own existence. Better to let younger, wiser people handle the burden of my declining abilities. I've been managing those things for nearly 4 decades, I said quietly. I think I can handle a few more years. But why should you have to? His voice took on a pleading quality, as if he were trying to sell me something for my own good. Why struggle with all that stress and responsibility when there's a better way? Sarah and I could handle the business side of everything. Taxes, insurance, maintenance contracts. You'd still live there, still make all the decisions about your daily life. You'd just be free from all the paperwork and worry. Free from ownership, you mean? Free from burden, he corrected, and protected if anything happens to you. Dad, you had a heart attack 4 years ago. What if it happens again? What if you're alone and can't get help? The heart attack. He'd been using it as a weapon ever since, the proof that I was fragile, mortal, in need of supervision. Never mind that I'd recovered completely, that my cardiologist had pronounced me in excellent health for a man my age, that I was probably in better shape than most people 20 years younger. The heart attack had given him ammunition in an argument I hadn't realized we were having. I have a medical alert system, I said. I have neighbors who are just as old as you are, he interrupted. Dad, be realistic. The Hendersons are in their 70s. The Petersons moved to Florida last year. Who's really looking out for you up there? I'm looking out for myself. Until you can't anymore. Until something happens and it's too late to make good decisions. The conversation was following a script he'd clearly rehearsed. Each of my objections met with responses that painted me as stubborn and unrealistic, while positioning him as the responsible adult, trying to save me from my own poor judgment. It was masterful in its way, the kind of manipulation that worked because it was wrapped in genuine-sounding concern. I need to think about this, I said finally. Of course you do. Take all the time you need. But Dad, don't take too long. Sarah's pregnant, and we need to start making concrete plans. We can't keep living in this limbo, not knowing what's going to happen or when. After he hung up, I sat in the quiet kitchen listening to the grandfather clock tick away another Sunday morning. Outside, the lake was gray under an overcast sky, small white caps suggesting wind from the northwest. Weather coming, probably snow before evening. The kind of day Linda would have spent baking bread and planning the week's meals while I winterized the dock and checked the storm windows. Instead, I was sitting alone, trying to understand how my son had become a stranger who spoke about my death like a business opportunity requiring advanced planning. The doorbell rang at noon. Through the frosted glass, I could see a small figure, Mrs. Henderson from across the lake, carrying what looked like a covered dish. I opened the door to find her bundling against the cold, her white hair escaping from a knitted hat that had seen better winters. Dick, I hope I'm not intruding. I made too much pot roast again, and Harold's watching the game. Thought you might like some company for lunch. Evelyn Henderson was 74, had been widowed and remarried, and possessed the kind of practical wisdom that came from raising 5 children and surviving 3 recessions. She and Harold had been our neighbors for 15 years. the kind of people who plowed your driveway without being asked and brought you soup when you were sick. I'd love the company, I said, meaning it more than she could know. We ate at the kitchen table, sharing pot roast and mashed potatoes, while she told me about Harold's latest project, building a greenhouse so she could start her tomatoes earlier next spring. Normal conversation between normal people who understood that life was meant to be lived rather than managed by committees of concerned relatives. "You seem distracted today," she said as we finished eating. "Everything all right?" I considered lying, maintaining the fiction that my life was proceeding smoothly, without complications. Instead, I found myself telling her about the engagement party, the trust documents, the gentle pressure to make decisions about my future for my own good. Evelyn listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious as the story progressed. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and studied me with eyes that had seen enough of life to recognize patterns others might miss. "My late husband's children tried the same thing with me," she said quietly. "After Tom passed, suddenly I was too old to manage the house alone, too vulnerable to make my own financial decisions. They had found a lovely assisted living facility, had spoken to lawyers about the best way to handle the estate, all very professional, very concerned, very convinced they knew what was best for poor, confused Evelyn. What did you do?" "I told them that when I needed their help, I'd ask for it, and until then, they could keep their opinions about my competence to themselves." She smiled, but it wasn't entirely pleasant. Funny how quickly concerned children become when there's property involved. We cleaned up the lunch dishes together, and she helped me put away the leftovers, enough pot roast for 3 more meals, given with the understanding that neighbors look after each other without expectation of repayment. After she left, I felt less alone, but more certain about what I was facing. This wasn't really about my age or my health or my ability to manage a house and property. This was about money, about assets, about a young couple who saw an opportunity to acquire valuable real estate without having to actually pay for it. The pregnancy was convenient timing, providing emotional leverage to make their request seem reasonable rather than greedy. I spent the afternoon in Linda's sewing room, a space I'd barely entered since her death. Her quilting frame still held her last project, a wedding ring pattern in shades of blue and gold that she'd been making for Michael, back when we'd all assumed he'd marry someone we actually knew and liked. Half finished, like so many plans that had been interrupted by her illness. On her desk, I found her address book and began making calls. First to her sister Margaret in Buffalo, then to her college roommate Dorothy in Syracuse, then to her closest friend from the garden club, Susan Walters, who lived in town and had been at the funeral when Michael had seemed more concerned with his phone than with mourning his mother. I didn't tell any of them the full story. That would have felt disloyal, like airing family problems for public consumption. Instead, I asked casual questions about their own children, their experiences with estate planning, their thoughts about family obligations and generational responsibility. The conversations were revealing in ways I hadn't expected. Margaret's daughter had tried to convince her to sell the family farm and move to senior housing. Dorothy's son had suggested she didn't need such a large house now that she was alone. Susan's children had been pressuring her to simplify her finances, consolidate her accounts, make things easier for them to manage when the time came. "It's epidemic," Susan said with the dry humor that had made her Linda's favorite companion for shopping trips and garden club meetings. All these middle-aged children suddenly discovering their parents are too incompetent to manage their own lives. Funny how the incompetence always involves property or money. By evening, I had a clearer picture of what I was dealing with. This wasn't personal, it was generational, a pattern playing out across the country as baby boomers inherited wealth from parents who'd built it through careful saving and hard work, while their own children calculated how to access that wealth before they were old enough to need nursing home care themselves. The snow started falling around 6, fat flakes that danced in the porch light and promised several inches by morning. I built a fire in the living room fireplace and sat in my chair, not Linda's chair, which I still couldn't bring myself to occupy, reading the trust documents more carefully. The language was dense, full of legal terminology and protective clauses, but the structure was clear. I would retain lifetime residence rights in property legally owned by the Patterson Family Trust. Michael and Sarah would serve as trustees, with full authority to make decisions about maintenance, improvements, and eventually sale. I would be consulted about major decisions, but not required to approve them. It was elegant in its way, providing the appearance of protection while ensuring complete loss of control. I would live in my own house as a guest, grateful for the privilege of occupying space that belonged to younger, wiser people who understood finance and estate planning and the complex realities of modern life. The more I read, the angrier I became. Not the hot anger of sudden betrayal, but the cold anger of calculated insult. They thought I was stupid. They thought I was weak. They thought I was so desperate for their approval and so frightened of being alone that I would sign away everything Linda and I had built together in exchange for empty promises of security and inclusion. They were wrong. I closed the documents and walked to the kitchen, where the expensive bottle of Macallan still sat on the counter like evidence of their miscalculation. $800 spent on a gift for a man who couldn't drink alcohol, supposedly chosen by a son who knew his father well enough to select something meaningful. Unless, of course, the gift wasn't meant to be meaningful. Unless it was meant to be symbolic, an expensive gesture that looked generous while actually demonstrating how little thought had been put into understanding what I might actually want or need. A bottle I couldn't drink from a son who didn't really know me anymore, accompanying documents that would make me a stranger in my own home. I picked up the bottle and carried it to the liquor cabinet, setting it next to the bourbon Linda had given me for our last anniversary together. 2 bottles of expensive alcohol I would never drink, representing 2 different kinds of love. One given with knowledge and affection, one given with calculation and expectation. Tomorrow, I would call Marcus Levy and begin the process of protecting what was mine. But tonight, I sat by the fire and remembered Linda's voice on the day we'd closed on this house. Her excitement as we'd planned where to put furniture, how to arrange the rooms, which trees to plant so they'd frame the lake view perfectly. "This is where we'll grow old together," she'd said, standing in the empty living room with sawdust in her hair and happiness in her eyes. "This is where we'll watch the seasons change, where we'll have grandchildren visit, where we'll sit on the porch when we're ancient and tell stories about when we were young." She'd been right about growing old here, wrong about doing it together. But the house still held her presence in every room, every carefully chosen detail, every decision made with love rather than calculation. Michael might see it as property requiring management, but it was the physical manifestation of a marriage, the shelter we'd created for a life lived in partnership and mutual respect. I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me, no matter how politely they asked or how reasonable their arguments sounded. Some things were worth fighting for, even if the fight was against people you'd once loved more than your own life. The fire burned low as the snow continued falling, and I sat in the warm darkness of my own home, planning for a war I'd never wanted to fight, but was absolutely determined to win. Monday morning brought 6 inches of fresh snow and a clarity I hadn't felt in months. I woke before dawn, not from restlessness, but from purpose, the way I used to wake during my contracting days when I had a complex job to plan and execute. The coffee tasted better, the house felt warmer, and even the grandfather clock seemed to tick with more authority, as if it approved of decisions finally being made. Marcus Levy's office occupied the 2nd floor of a brick building on Main Street that had housed lawyers since before the Civil War. The stairs creaked under my weight, old wood that had heard decades of secrets and seen countless battles over money, property, and family honor. Marcus met me at the door, looking younger than his 68 years, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of handshake that suggested he'd been waiting for this appointment with interest. "Dick, you sounded urgent on the phone. What's the situation?" I handed him the trust documents without preamble. "My son wants me to sign these. Says it's for my own protection." Marcus settled behind his desk and began reading, his expression growing more serious with each page. Occasionally, he made small sounds. Not quite disapproval, but professional recognition of familiar patterns. After 20 minutes, he set the papers aside and leaned back in his chair. "This is sophisticated work," he said finally. "Expensive legal counsel, carefully crafted language. Your son has been getting good advice." "From whom?" "The letterhead says Morrison, Kellerman, and Associates. They're a Manhattan firm that specializes in high net worth estate planning, the kind of lawyers who charge $600 an hour and know every legal trick in the book." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Manhattan lawyers, for a trust involving a house in upstate New York. Exactly. This isn't the kind of document you'd need unless you were dealing with significant assets and complex family dynamics. Marcus picked up the papers again, flipping to a particular section. Look at this clause here. The trustees have broad authority to make decisions about property improvements, maintenance, even sale if they determine it's in the beneficiary's best interest. And this section defines best interest so broadly that it could justify almost anything, such as selling the house if they decide you'd be better off in assisted living, renting it out if they determine you don't need the full space, converting it to commercial use if market conditions warrant, all with your supposed benefit as justification. The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in with the weight of what I was learning. And I'd have no recourse? You'd have lifetime residence rights, Marcus said, with the kind of emphasis that made the phrase sound like a polite fiction. Until the trustees determine that your best interests require alternative living arrangements, at which point your residence rights become negotiable. I stood and walked to his window, looking down at Main Street where normal people were conducting normal business, buying groceries, stopping at the bank, going about their lives without having to worry about legal documents designed to separate them from everything they owned. Snow was still falling, lighter now but persistent, the kind that would keep accumulating all day. "What would you do?" I asked. Same thing I did when my late wife's children tried something similar after she passed. I'd tell them that when I need their help, I'll ask for it. And until then, they can keep their concerns about my competence to themselves. I turned back to face him. Evelyn Henderson said something almost identical yesterday. Marcus smiled grimly. It's an epidemic. Adult children who have decided their parents are too incompetent to manage their own affairs usually coincides with those affairs being worth taking over. So, what are my options? Several. You could sign the documents and hope for the best. You could negotiate different terms, more restrictive trustee powers, clearer definitions of your rights. Or, he paused, studying me with the kind of attention that suggested he was calculating whether I had the spine for more aggressive action. Or, you could make it impossible for them to contest your competence or manipulate your property. Remove their leverage entirely. How? Marcus opened his desk drawer and pulled out a fresh legal pad. Tell me about your financial situation. Not the details, just the general picture. House paid off? Significant debt? Other assets? I gave him the overview. The house owned free and clear, worth perhaps $700,000 with the lakefront footage. A 401k from my contracting days worth about $300,000. Social Security, a small pension, some CDs and savings accounts that generated enough income to cover my modest expenses. No debt except utility bills and property taxes. So, you're financially independent. Don't need their support, don't need their management, don't need their protection. Marcus was making notes as he spoke. That's good. It means you have options they don't expect. What kind of options? The nuclear option, you could donate the property to charity, get a significant tax deduction, maintain lifetime residence rights through a different legal structure, and remove it permanently from family inheritance disputes. Or you could sell it and move somewhere they can't find you. Or you could transfer ownership to an irrevocable trust with yourself, as lifetime beneficiary, but with trustees they can't influence or control. Each option felt like a door opening onto possibilities I hadn't considered. Not just ways to resist their pressure, but ways to make their entire strategy irrelevant. The charity donation, I said. How would that work? Marcus began sketching a diagram on his legal pad. You deed the property to a qualified charity, land conservancy maybe, or historical society. They give you a tax receipt for the full appraised value. You retain lifetime residence rights through a separate agreement. When you die, the property belongs to the charity permanently. Your son inherits nothing, but you've supported a cause you believe in and eliminated their ability to pressure you. And I could still live there. Until you die or choose to leave. The charity might even help with maintenance costs in exchange for the eventual donation. It's a clean solution that removes the property from family disputes while giving you complete control over your living arrangements. The idea was appealing in its simplicity and finality. No negotiations, no compromises, no lifetime residence rights that could be reinterpreted by trustees with their own agenda. Just a clean transfer that accomplished exactly what Michael claimed to want: protection of the property and security for my future, while eliminating his ability to manipulate either one. I'd like to explore that option, I said. I'll make some calls this afternoon. There are several organizations that specialize in this kind of arrangement. Land conservancies are probably your best bet. They understand lakefront property values and have experience with lifetime residence agreements. We spent another hour going through the legal mechanics, the tax implications, the timeline for making such a decision. Marcus would prepare the preliminary paperwork, contact appropriate organizations, and research the legal requirements for ensuring the donation couldn't be challenged later. He estimated we could have everything ready within 2 weeks if I decided to proceed. "One more thing," he said as I prepared to leave. "Don't discuss this with anyone in your family until you've made your decision. If they get wind of what you're planning, they might accelerate their own timeline, create pressure situations that make it harder for you to act independently." "You think they'd do that?" Marcus looked at me with the kind of expression that came from 40 years of handling family legal disputes. "Dick, they've already hired Manhattan lawyers to draft documents designed to separate you from your property. They're not playing games here, neither should you." The drive home took me past the Morrison Development Group offices, a glass and steel building that looked like it had been dropped into the rural landscape by aliens with good taste and unlimited budgets. Several expensive cars sat in the visitor parking area, and I could see people in suits moving around inside, conducting the kind of business that generated enough profit to hire $600 an hour lawyers. This wasn't just about Michael anymore, I realized. This was about a family with resources and experience in acquiring property who saw my lake house as a valuable addition to their portfolio. Sarah's pregnancy was convenient timing, but the pressure would have come eventually once they'd calculated the property's worth and my vulnerability as an aging widower with no other children to advocate for his interests. At home, I found a message on my answering machine, Michael's voice, carefully casual. "Dad, just checking in. Hope you're thinking about our conversation yesterday. Sarah's been looking at baby furniture catalogs, talking about nurseries and play areas. She's so excited about raising our children in the house where I grew up. Call me when you get a chance." The message felt calculated to appeal to my sentimental attachment to family continuity, my grandchildren playing in the same rooms where their father had played, learning to swim off the same dock, building memories in the same spaces that had shaped Michael's childhood. It would have been touching if it hadn't been accompanied by legal documents designed to ensure my eventual eviction from those same spaces. I didn't call him back. Instead, I spent the afternoon going through Linda's papers, looking for documents that might be relevant to charitable giving. She'd been generous with local organizations, the Hospital Foundation, the Library Building Fund, the Historical Society that maintained the old mill down by the river. In her desk, I found thank you letters from various charities, tax receipts for donations, even some research she'd done about setting up a scholarship fund in her parents' names. One letter caught my attention, from the Finger Lakes Land Conservancy, thanking her for a donation made in memory of her father. The letterhead showed a photograph of preserved lakefront property that looked remarkably similar to our own shoreline. The accompanying brochure explained their mission: protecting the natural character of the region's lakes and forests through conservation easements and property donations. I called the number on the letterheads and was connected to someone named Jennifer Walsh, who sounded genuinely enthusiastic when I explained my interest in potentially donating lakefront property. "Mr. Patterson, that's wonderful. We're always looking for opportunities to preserve critical shoreline habitat. Could you tell me a bit about the property?" I described the house, the acreage, the pristine lake frontage that had remained undeveloped for nearly 40 years. Jennifer asked thoughtful questions about the property's ecological features, its current condition, and my motivations for considering donation. "Our lifetime residence program is very popular with donors in your situation," she said. "You maintain complete control over the property during your lifetime. We help with some maintenance costs, and when you're ready to move, or when the property eventually passes to us, it's permanently protected from development. Everyone wins. You get tax benefits and peace of mind, we get valuable conservation land, and the community gets preserved green space." We scheduled a property visit for Thursday, contingent on the weather clearing. Jennifer would bring an appraiser and their legal counsel to assess the property's conservation value and explain the lifetime residence agreement in detail. After I hung up, I sat in Linda's sewing room, looking at her unfinished quilt, the wedding ring pattern she'd been making for Michael, back when we'd all assumed his marriage would be to someone we knew and loved, in a ceremony we'd helped plan, followed by grandchildren who would know their grandfather as more than just the old man who used to own their house. The irony wasn't lost on me. In trying to secure their inheritance, Michael and Sarah had virtually guaranteed they wouldn't receive one. Their pressure tactics had pushed me toward a solution that accomplished their stated goals, protecting the property and ensuring my security, while eliminating their ability to benefit from either outcome. But as I folded Linda's quilt and put it away, I realized this wasn't really about money or property or even family dynamics. This was about respect, the basic human dignity of being allowed to make your own decisions about your own life, even if those decisions weren't what others would choose for you. Michael had looked at me across that country club dining table and seen an aging man whose judgment couldn't be trusted, whose independence was a burden requiring management, whose attachment to his own home was selfish and impractical. He'd forgotten that independence earned through decades of work and careful planning wasn't something you surrendered just because younger people thought they could manage your life better than you could. The snow had stopped by evening, leaving the world clean and bright under a full moon that turned the lake into a mirror of silver light. I built a fire in the living room and sat in my chair, still not Linda's chair, but my own familiar place, with a cup of coffee and a growing sense of anticipation. Tomorrow I would call Marcus and tell him to proceed with the charity donation research. Thursday I would meet with the Land Conservancy representatives and begin the process of permanently protecting the property Linda and I had loved. By Christmas, if all went well, the house would be legally beyond Michael's reach while remaining completely under my control. It wasn't revenge exactly. It was justice, the quiet, methodical kind that ensured the right outcome without requiring drama or confrontation. Michael would eventually learn what I'd done, but by then it would be irreversible, a fait accompli that eliminated the need for further discussion about my competence or my future. The grandfather clock chimed 11 times as I banked the fire and prepared for bed. Outside, the lake reflected stars that seemed closer than usual, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called through the winter silence. For the first time in months, I slept soundly, dreaming not of loss or betrayal, but of spring mornings when the ice would break up and the water would flow freely again, carrying away the debris of winter storms and making room for whatever came next. The invitation arrived on a Thursday in March, delivered by the same expensive courier service that had brought the whiskey and the first engagement party summons. This time, the envelope was addressed in formal calligraphy, Mr. Richard Patterson, on paper so thick it felt like fabric between my fingers. Inside, a wedding invitation that probably cost more than most people spent on the entire ceremony. Sarah Elizabeth Morrison and Michael David Patterson, requesting the pleasure of my company at their union on Saturday, April 29th, at the Morrison family estate in Millbrook. I stared at the invitation for a long time, noting what it didn't say as much as what it did. No mention of my role in the ceremony, not walking Michael down the aisle in Linda's absence, not giving a father's blessing, not even being seated in the traditional father of the groom position. Just Mr. Richard Patterson, like any other guest who might or might not attend. The RSVP card was pre-stamped and addressed, with a deadline 3 weeks away. Plenty of time to decide whether I wanted to watch my son marry into a family that had already drawn up documents to steal my house, or whether I preferred to spend the day fishing on Clear Lake while they celebrated their strategic alliance. 5 months had passed since that night at the Westchester Country Club, 5 months during which my life had taken on a structure and purpose I hadn't felt since Linda's death. The Finger Lakes Land Conservancy had appraised the property at $850,000, more than I'd expected, thanks to the pristine shoreline and the growing scarcity of undeveloped lakefront land. The tax benefits alone would eliminate my federal taxes for several years, while the lifetime residence agreement guaranteed I could live here until I chose to leave or drew my last breath. The paperwork was signed, notarized, and filed with the county. As of February 15, 24, the Patterson Lake House legally belonged to the Finger Lakes Land Conservancy, held in trust for the permanent protection of critical watershed habitat. I retained lifetime residence rights, with the Conservancy covering property taxes and major maintenance in exchange for eventual full ownership upon my death. Michael didn't know yet, neither did Sarah or her parents or their expensive Manhattan lawyers. The trust documents they had given me still sat in my desk drawer, unsigned and irrelevant, waiting for a signature that would never come, because there was nothing left to sign away. Marcus had advised waiting to tell them, letting the legal transfer season into uncontestable fact before revealing that their entire strategy had become pointless. "Let them think they're still negotiating," he had said with the dry satisfaction of a lawyer who had outmaneuvered more expensive colleagues. People make mistakes when they think they're winning. But sitting in my kitchen with their wedding invitation, I realized the time for patience was ending. They deserved to know what they'd accomplished with their pressure tactics and legal maneuvering. They deserved to understand the consequences of treating family like a business acquisition requiring proper management. I called Marcus that afternoon. "Dick, how's retirement treating you?" "Conservancy retirement is excellent," I said, which had become our private joke about my new status as a ward of environmental protection. "I'm calling about the wedding. I think it's time." "You're going to tell them?" "I'm going to show them. At the wedding. Public venue, lots of witnesses, no opportunity for private pressure or emotional manipulation. Just the facts, delivered with appropriate ceremony." Marcus was quiet for a moment, probably weighing the professional ethics of what I was suggesting against the poetic justice it represented. Finally, "What do you need from me?" "Documentation, official copies of the transfer, the conservancy agreement, maybe a letter from Jennifer Walsh confirming the arrangement. Something impressive looking that makes it clear this isn't a negotiable situation. I can have everything ready by next week, but Dick, you understand this is going to burn bridges? There's no coming back from this kind of public revelation." I thought about Michael's voice on the answering machine, casual and confident as he'd talked about Sarah looking at baby furniture, planning nurseries in rooms that would never belong to them. I thought about Patricia Morrison's gentle suggestions about assisted living. Ann Williams' calculating smile as he discussed proper management of my assets. "Some bridges need burning," I said. The next 3 weeks passed with the strange calm that comes before inevitable storms. I continued my normal routines, morning coffee, afternoon walks around the property, evening fires in the living room, while beneath the surface, anticipation built like pressure behind a dam. Jennifer Walsh from the Conservancy stopped by twice, once to deliver official documentation of the transfer, and once to discuss preliminary plans for eventual public access trails that would preserve the property's natural character while allowing limited educational use. "You've given the community an amazing gift," she said, standing on the dock where Michael had learned to fish 30 years ago. "This shoreline will be protected forever now, exactly as it is today." "That was the idea," I said, though I didn't tell her that protection from development had been less important to me than protection from family acquisition. Some motivations were better kept private. I bought a new suit for the wedding, my first new suit in a decade, charcoal gray with a subtle pinstripe that made me look more prosperous than I felt. The tailor was a small man with careful hands who'd been fitting clothes for wealthy clients for 40 years. He understood that sometimes a man needs armor more than fashion. "Special occasion?" he asked as he marked the hem. "My son's wedding. Should be memorable." The morning of April 29th dawned clear and warm, the kind of spring day that makes you believe in new beginnings and fresh starts. I dressed carefully, adding Linda's favorite tie, burgundy silk with small gold diamonds, and the cufflinks she'd given me for our 25th anniversary. If I was going to deliver news that would end my relationship with my only child, I wanted her presence with me as much as possible. The Morrison estate was everything the country club had promised to be. Rolling lawns that looked like golf course fairways, gardens that required full-time staff to maintain, and a house that belonged in architectural magazines rather than family neighborhoods. Cars lined the circular drive like an auto show for people who measured success in German engineering and Italian leather. I parked my Silverado between a Mercedes and a BMW, watching the valet's expression as he took my keys. Inside the truck, I had a leather portfolio containing the documentation Marcus had prepared, official copies of the property transfer, the conservancy agreement, and a letter from Jennifer Walsh, confirming that the Patterson Lake House now belonged permanently to environmental protection rather than family inheritance. The ceremony was held in a garden pavilion overlooking the Hudson Valley, with views that probably added $50,000 to the property's value. 200 guests filled white chairs arranged in perfect rows, most of them strangers who looked like they'd stepped out of a country club membership directory. I was seated in the 5th row, behind distant cousins and college friends, in a spot that provided an excellent view of the proceedings, while making it clear I was not part of the immediate family. Michael stood at the altar in a tuxedo that had been professionally fitted, his shoulders square and his smile confident as he waited for his bride. He looked prosperous and handsome and entirely at ease in this environment of casual wealth and social privilege. When his eyes found me in the crowd, he nodded briefly. Acknowledgement without warmth, the kind of gesture you'd give to a business associate whose presence was expected but not particularly welcome. Sarah entered to the sound of a string quartet, walking down an aisle scattered with rose petals that had probably been flown in from somewhere exotic. She was beautiful in the way that money and careful planning could create. Perfect dress, perfect hair, perfect smile that suggested she was exactly where she belonged. Her father walked beside her with the satisfied expression of a man completing a successful business transaction. The ceremony was elegant and impersonal, conducted by a minister who spoke about love and commitment with the practiced tone of someone who performed weddings for wealthy families every weekend. Michael and Sarah exchanged vows they had written themselves, full of promises about building a life together and creating a legacy for future generations. Neither mentioned his father or acknowledged that marriage involved joining existing families rather than creating new ones from scratch. During the ring exchange, Michael's eyes found mine again. This time he smiled, the kind of smile that suggested everything was proceeding according to plan, that my presence here represented acceptance of their new arrangement, that the trust documents were probably waiting in my mailbox when I returned home. The reception was held on a terrace overlooking formal gardens, with round tables that seated 10 and centerpieces that cost more than most people spent on anniversary dinners. I was placed at table 7, between someone's aunt from Connecticut and a business associate of William Morrison's, who spent the appetizer course explaining why waterfront property was the safest investment in an uncertain economy. Location, 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 he said, gesturing with his wine glass toward the Hudson River Valley. They're not making any more lakefront land, especially the pristine kind. Your son did well, marrying into a family that understands real estate values. Indeed he did, I agreed, thinking about the legal documents in my portfolio and the conversation that was still several hours away. The toasts began after dinner, a succession of family members and friends who spoke about the happy couple's bright future and the blessing of joining 2 successful families. William Morrison raised his glass to the next generation of leaders who will carry forward our traditions of community service and business excellence. Patricia Morrison spoke about Sarah's happiness and the joy of welcoming Michael into their family as the son we never had. I sat quietly through it all, sipping wine I couldn't taste and waiting for the right moment. It came during the father of the groom's speech when the master of ceremonies announced that Michael's father would like to offer his blessing to the happy couple. I stood slowly, feeling every eye in the room turn toward me. The portfolio was in my left hand, hidden against my leg where the assembled guests couldn't see it. My voice, when I spoke, carried clearly across the silent terrace. Thank you all for including me in this celebration. Michael, Sarah, I hope your marriage brings you everything you're hoping for, and perhaps teaches you some things you are not expecting. I paused, looking directly at my son. His smile had become fixed, uncertain, like he was trying to calculate where this speech might be heading. When Linda and I got married 47 years ago, we made promises about supporting each other through good times and bad, about building something together that would last beyond our individual lives. We kept those promises by creating a home that reflected our values, our love for each other, and our commitment to leaving the world a little better than we found it. The crowd murmured approval. This sounded like standard wedding sentiment, the kind of gentle wisdom expected from older relatives who had successfully navigated long marriages. That home, the lake house where Michael grew up, where he learned to swim and fish and build things with his own hands, represented everything Linda and I believed about family, about permanence, about the responsibility we have to protect what we love. Michael's expression was changing now, confusion replacing confidence as he sensed something unexpected in my tone. Which is why I'm so pleased to announce that as of February 15th, that property has been permanently protected through donation to the Finger Lakes Land Conservancy. The silence that followed was profound, like the moment after lightning when you're waiting for thunder. I could see people trying to process what they had heard, to understand why a property donation was being announced at a wedding reception. The house and 43 acres of pristine lakefront land now belong to the people of New York State, held in trust for environmental protection and public education. It will never be developed, never be sold, never be transferred to private ownership again. Michael was on his feet now, his face pale with understanding. Dad, what are you— I retain lifetime residence rights, of course, I continued, my voice steady and clear. I'll live there until I choose to leave, or until I die, whichever comes first. But when that time comes, the property will remain with the Conservancy permanently. Sarah was gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles white against the cream-colored cloth. William Morrison looked like he'd swallowed something distasteful. Patricia's mouth was slightly open, her carefully applied lipstick making her expression almost comical in its shock. I want to thank the Morrison family for helping me reach this decision. Your thoughtful suggestions about my need for professional management of my assets made me realize how important it was to ensure the property would be properly cared for by people who understand its true value, not as a financial asset, but as an irreplaceable piece of our natural heritage. I reached into my portfolio and withdrew the documentation Marcus had prepared. I have copies of the transfer documents here, if anyone would like to review the details. Everything has been properly filed with the county and the state. The arrangement is irrevocable and permanent. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Then William Morrison found his voice, low and dangerous. Richard, surely this can be undone. Paperwork can be corrected, mistakes can be remedied. No mistake, I said pleasantly. This was exactly what I intended. My property is now permanently protected from development, speculation, or transfer to private parties who might not appreciate its environmental significance. Michael stepped forward, his hands clenched at his sides. Dad, we need to talk, privately, now. I think we've talked enough, I said. Besides, this is a celebration. We shouldn't let family business interfere with Sarah's special day. I set the portfolio on the table, the documentation spread out where anyone could examine it. Official seals, legal signatures, conservation easements, all the bureaucratic poetry that transformed private property into public trust. Congratulations to the happy couple, I said, raising my wine glass. May your marriage bring you exactly what you deserve. The toast hung in the air, unacknowledged by the head table where Michael and Sarah sat frozen in their wedding finery, surrounded by the ruins of their carefully laid plans. Other guests began to murmur, sensing drama without understanding its full scope, looking between me and the newlyweds with the fascination people reserve for public disasters. I finished my wine, set the glass on the table, and walked toward the parking area where the valet waited with increasingly obvious nervousness. Behind me, I could hear voices rising, Michael calling my name, Sarah's tears, William Morrison's angry demands for explanation, but I didn't turn back. The valet brought my truck quickly, probably grateful to be rid of whatever controversy I'd created. As I drove down the circular drive, I could see wedding guests clustered on the terrace, gesturing toward my departing vehicle, already beginning the process of turning the evening's events into stories they'd tell at other social gatherings. The drive home took 2 hours through spring countryside that looked achingly beautiful in the late afternoon light. Apple orchards in bloom, pastures dotted with cattle, small towns where people lived simple lives, uncomplicated by trust documents and estate planning strategies. I drove with my windows down, breathing air that smelled of new grass and possibility. At home, I changed into work clothes and walked down to the dock. The lake was calm, reflecting the last light of day like polished bronze. Somewhere across the water, a loon called, the same wild, lonely sound that had provided the soundtrack for 37 years of mornings and evenings shared with Linda. I sat on the dock until full dark, thinking about the look in Michael's eyes when he'd realized what I'd done, the shock in Sarah's expression as she'd watched her inheritance evaporate in the space of a wedding toast. There was no satisfaction in it exactly, but there was completion, the sense of a story reaching its proper ending, of accounts being settled in ways that honored truth over convenience. The grandfather clock was chiming 10 when I finally went inside. On the answering machine, 17 messages waited, most of them from Michael, his voice progressing from confusion to anger to something that might have been grief. I deleted them without listening to more than a few words each. Tomorrow there would be consequences, probably legal challenges that would prove futile but expensive. There would be angry letters from Morrison lawyers, threats from William about consulting ethics and competency proceedings, tears from Sarah about the future they'd planned for their unborn children. But tonight, I sat in my living room with a cup of coffee and Linda's photograph, surrounded by the familiar sounds of a house that would never be sold, never be transferred, never be managed by people who confused love with control. The fire crackled in the grate. The grandfather clock marked time with steady authority, and outside my windows, the protected lake reflected stars that had witnessed everything human plans could do to each other, and outlasted them all. I had given my son a wedding gift, after all. Not the gift he'd expected, but the one he had earned. The knowledge that some things in life couldn't be taken, only received or rejected. Michael had made his choice months ago, in a country club dining room where he'd looked at his father and seen an asset requiring management rather than a man deserving respect. Now he would live with the consequences of that choice, just as I would live with mine. The difference was, I could sleep peacefully in my own bed, in my own house, on my own land, which would remain mine in all the ways that mattered until the day I died. The aftermath began at 6:30 the next morning with the sound of tires on gravel that had become as familiar as my own heartbeat. Through the kitchen window, I watched Michael's BMW pull into the driveway, not the careful, respectful parking of a son visiting his father, but the aggressive positioning of someone who intended to have a confrontation, whether I wanted one or not. I was already dressed, had been awake since 4, with the kind of alertness that follows decisive action. Coffee was brewing, the documentation from last night's announcement spread across the kitchen table like battle plans, and I felt more prepared for whatever came next than I had for anything in the 3 years since Linda's death. Michael didn't knock. The front door opened with the authority of someone who still thought he had rights in this house, followed by footsteps that echoed through the hallway with barely controlled fury. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, still wearing his wedding tuxedo, though the bow tie hung loose around his neck and the formal shirt was wrinkled from what had obviously been a sleepless night. "We need to talk," he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and anger. "Good morning, Michael. Congratulations on your marriage. Coffee?" "Don't." He stepped into the kitchen, his hands clenched at his sides. "Don't pretend this is a normal conversation. Don't pretend what you did last night was anything other than a deliberate attempt to humiliate me in front of Sarah's family." I poured myself a cup of coffee, noting that my hands were steady, my breathing calm. 3 months of knowing this moment would come had prepared me better than I'd expected. "I announced a charitable donation at your wedding reception. Most people would consider that appropriate. You sabotaged our future. You destroyed everything we'd planned, everything we'd worked toward." His voice was rising, the careful modulation of the successful businessman, giving way to something raw and more desperate. "Do you have any idea what you've done? I've permanently protected 43 acres of critical watershed habitat from development or speculation. I've ensured that the land your mother and I loved will remain exactly as it is for future generations to enjoy. I've honored the values Linda and I shared about environmental responsibility and community service." Each word was chosen carefully, the language of a man who'd thought through every justification and found them all more satisfying than the truth, that I'd simply refused to be manipulated by people who thought they were smarter than me. Michael's face flushed darker. "Cut the conservation bullshit, Dad. This was about revenge. This was about punishing us for trying to help you." "Help me what? Give up ownership of my own home? Sign away 40 years of work and savings to people who think I'm too incompetent to manage my own life? We never said you were incompetent. You hired Manhattan lawyers to draft documents that would have made me a tenant in my own house. You brought your fiance's parents to pressure me about my declining abilities and need for professional management. You talked about my best interests like I wasn't sitting right there, capable of understanding every word you said. The truth hung between us like a sword, sharp-edged and cutting." Michael's jaw worked silently, searching for arguments that wouldn't sound like admissions of exactly what I'd accused him of. "The property was supposed to be my inheritance," he said finally, the pretense of concern stripped away to reveal the raw calculation underneath. "Everything you and Mom built, it was supposed to come to me, to my children, to carry on the family legacy." "What family legacy? You haven't been home for Christmas in 2 years. You missed your mother's birthday every year for the last decade of her life. You call maybe 6 times a year, and half of those are because you need something. I was building a career, establishing myself. You were deciding we weren't important enough to make time for, and now you want to inherit the results of a life you couldn't be bothered to participate in." Michael slammed his palm against the kitchen counter, making the coffee cups jump. "This is my family's history too, my childhood, my memories, The place where I learned to swim and fish and which you couldn't wait to leave behind for something better, something more sophisticated than a contractor's son could provide. The words came out harder than I'd intended, carrying 3 years of accumulated hurt and disappointment. Michael stepped back as if I'd struck him, his face going pale beneath the anger. That's not fair. Isn't it? When's the last time you visited because you wanted to spend time with me, not because you needed money or a favor, or somewhere to bring your girlfriend to impress her with the quaint lake house your parents owned? Silence settled between us, broken only by the grandfather clock ticking away another morning that would change everything between us forever. Michael stared out the window toward the lake, his shoulders sagging with something that might have been recognition. I love this place, he said quietly. I plan to raise my children here, to give them the same kind of childhood I had. Past tense. You loved it. When you were young and it served your purposes, but you never loved it enough to preserve what made it special, the family that created it, the values that sustained it, the relationships that gave it meaning. I could have preserved all that. Sarah and I, we would have taken care of you, made sure you were comfortable, included you in our children's lives, as a guest in my own home, subject to your decisions about what was best for me, when I could make changes, whether I was still competent enough to live independently. Michael's gang opened and closed at his sides, searching for arguments that might bridge the gap between what he'd intended and what he'd actually proposed. We were trying to protect you, protect the property, make sure everything was handled properly when you got older, when you couldn't manage anymore. When I couldn't manage anymore, or when you decided I couldn't manage anymore. There's a difference, Michael. One involves my choice, my timing, my dignity. The other involves being managed like an asset requiring professional oversight. He turned back to face me, his eyes bright with unshed tears that might have been grief or frustration or simple exhaustion. So, what happens now? You live here alone until you die, and then strangers get everything Mom and Dad built together? Strangers who will protect it forever, exactly as your mother would have wanted. People who understand that some things are more valuable than their market price. And me, your only child, what do I get? I looked at him, really looked at him, seeing not the successful businessman in the expensive tuxedo, but the boy who'd once helped me stack firewood and rake leaves, who'd ask serious questions about why buildings stood up and what made engines run. That boy deserved an honest answer. You get the chance to build something of your own, the way Linda and I did. You get to earn your success instead of inheriting it, to create value instead of just managing it. You get to be a man your children will respect for what you accomplished, not what you inherited. That's easy for you to say. You had decades to build all this. Sarah's pregnant, we have expenses, obligations. We started with nothing but a willingness to work and a commitment to each other. No family money, no inherited property, no trust funds or connections. Just two people who decided they wanted to build something together. Times were different then. Everything's more expensive now, more complicated. Everything's always been expensive and complicated, son. The difference is we didn't expect anyone else to solve our problems for us. Michael stared at me for a long moment, his expression cycling through anger, grief, and something that might have been understanding. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet, defeated. I can't undo this, can I? There's no legal challenge, no way to reverse what you've done. The transfer is irrevocable. The Conservancy has legal title, the state has approved the donation, the IRS has processed the tax benefits. It's over, Michael. Your inheritance is gone, and no amount of lawyering can bring it back. He nodded slowly, like a man accepting a diagnosis he had been hoping to avoid. Sarah's going to be devastated. Her parents, they'd already started making plans, talking about development possibilities, ways to maximize the property's potential. Then they misunderstood the situation from the beginning. This was never theirs to plan for. They think you've lost your mind. William was talking last night about competency hearings, about proving you weren't mentally capable of making this kind of decision. The threat didn't surprise me. Marcus had warned that the Morrisons might try legal challenges once they realized their strategy had failed. But it did clarify something important about the kind of people Michael had married into. Let them try, I said calmly. I had full psychological and medical evaluations done before signing any documents. Dr. Reeves confirmed I'm in excellent health, both physically and mentally. Marcus documented every step of the process, made sure there were no grounds for later challenge. Any competency hearing would just waste their money and make them look foolish. Michael's mice went through another series of expressions as he processed this information. You planned this, all of it, from the moment we first talked about the trust documents. I planned to protect what your mother and I built together. Your pressure tactics just helped me decide how. And if we'd been different, if we'd approached this differently, more respectfully, it was a good question, one I'd asked myself during the long months of preparation. If Michael had come to me as a son seeking advice rather than as a businessman managing a potential acquisition, would the outcome have been different? If you'd talked to me about your concerns instead of hiring lawyers to draft documents designed to separate me from my property, if you'd asked for my help instead of assuming I was too incompetent to make my own decisions, if you'd treated me like your father instead of like an obstacle to your financial planning, I paused, looking out at the lake where morning mist was beginning to lift, revealing water that looked like polished steel in the early light. Maybe. We'll never know now. Michael followed my gaze toward the window, his expression softening with what might have been memory. I used to think this place was the most beautiful spot in the world. Summer mornings when the mist was lifting, winter evenings when the ice looked like glass. I wanted my children to see it the way I saw it. They still can. The Conservancy will maintain public access trails, educational programs. Your children can visit, can learn about the ecosystem, can understand why some places are too important to own. But they'll never live here, never have the bedroom I grew up in, never learn to fish from that dock, never build snow forts in that backyard. No, they'll build their own memories in places you create for them, with values you teach them, through relationships you nurture, the way it should be. He was quiet for a long time, staring out at the lake with an expression I couldn't read. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a finality that told me this conversation was ending. I should go. Sarah's waiting, and we need to figure out what comes next. Michael. He stopped at the kitchen doorway, not turning back but listening. I hope your marriage is happy. I hope you raise children who love and respect you. I hope you build something together that lasts. He didn't answer, just continued through the hallway and out the front door. I listened to his car start, heard the tires crunch on gravel as he backed out of the driveway, watched through the window as he disappeared down Lakeshore Drive toward a future that no longer included inheriting everything his parents had worked to create. The house felt different after he left, not empty, but settled, like the quiet that follows the resolution of a long-held chord. I poured fresh coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the documentation from last night's announcement, reading through the legal language that had permanently altered my family's trajectory. The phone rang at 9:30. Marcus's voice, amused but professional. Dick, I've had 3 calls already this morning from Morrison, Kellerman, and Associates. They're threatening everything from fraud charges to mental competency proceedings. Want me to be worried? Want me to be? Not particularly. They're fishing, hoping you made some procedural error they can exploit. But we dotted every I and crossed every T. The donation is bulletproof. Good. What about the competency threat? Bluster, mostly. They'd need evidence of mental incapacity at the time you signed the documents. And we have medical evaluations proving exactly the opposite. Worst case scenario, they file something and waste their client's money on a case they can't win. After Marcus hung up, I walked through the house slowly, seeing it with new eyes. Not as property I owned, but as a place I'd been entrusted to care for during my remaining years. The Conservancy would eventually maintain it as an educational center and nature preserve, sharing its beauty with people who would appreciate it without trying to possess it. In Linda's sewing room, I found her unfinished quilt, the wedding ring pattern she'd been making for Michael, back when we'd all assumed his marriage would be something to celebrate. I folded it carefully and put it away in the cedar chest with her other projects, memorials to a different kind of future than the one that had actually unfolded. The afternoon brought a different visitor, Sarah, arriving alone in a white Mercedes that looked like it had never been driven anywhere more challenging than country club parking lots. She knocked softly, waited politely when I opened the door, asked permission before entering like someone who finally understood she had no automatic rights in this space. "Mr. Patterson, could we talk, please?" She was still beautiful, but the polish from last night's wedding had been replaced by something more genuine. Red eyes that suggested real tears, an expression that carried actual emotion rather than calculated charm. I invited her into the living room, offering coffee she declined, while taking the chair farthest from where I sat. Michael told me what you said this morning, about building our own life instead of inheriting yours. She twisted her wedding ring, the diamonds catching afternoon light from the windows. I want you to know that I never intended to push you out of your own home. What did you intend? Security. For all of us. My parents, they're very practical people, very good at seeing potential problems before they become actual problems. When they met you, they saw a man living alone in a valuable property, and they worried about what would happen if you got sick or injured or became too incompetent to manage my own life. She flinched. They worried about you being taken advantage of by people who might not have your best interests at heart. Elder abuse is common, financial exploitation, people who prey on lonely seniors. So they decided to prey on me first, for my own protection. That's not how they saw it. They saw it as family taking care of family, making sure everyone was protected and persisted for. I looked at her, sitting in my living room, wearing clothes that cost more than most people's monthly salary, talking about protection and provision with the confidence of someone who'd never had to worry about either. Young, beautiful, pregnant with my grandchild, and absolutely convinced that her family's wealth and sophistication gave them the right to reorganize other people's lives for their own good. Sarah, what did you know about Linda and me when you first met Michael? The question seemed to surprise her. What do you mean? Our story, how we met, how we built this life, what we valued, what we worked for. What did Michael tell you about his parents? She was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking through how to answer without revealing too much. He said you were good people, hard-working, salt-of-the-earth types who'd given him a stable childhood and good values. Salt-of-the-earth types, like characters in a heartwarming story about simple folk who don't understand the complexities of modern life. I didn't mean it that way, but that's how you saw us, isn't it? Quaint, well-meaning people who needed guidance from more sophisticated family members who understood things like estate planning and asset management. Sarah's composure finally cracked, tears spilling down her cheeks with an authenticity I hadn't seen since she'd arrived. I'm 28 years old. I've never had to worry about money or security or taking care of aging parents. My family, we handle these things with lawyers and financial advisors and trust documents because that's what we know, how we protect the people we love. But we weren't your people to protect. I wasn't a problem requiring your family's solution. I know that now. She wiped her eyes with a tissue from her purse, leaving mascara stains that made her look younger and more vulnerable. Michael's been trying to explain why you did this, and I think I'm finally beginning to understand. You weren't being stubborn or unreasonable. You were being human. It was perhaps the most honest thing anyone in her family had said to me, and it carried more weight because it came after she'd lost everything she'd hoped to gain. What will you do now? I asked. Build something of our own, like you said. Michael's talking about leaving his current job, maybe starting his own consulting firm. We'll buy a house we can afford, raise our children with values we teach them, try to earn the kind of respect and security my parents have always taken for granted. That sounds like a good plan. Mr. Patterson? She hesitated, then met my eyes directly. I know you probably won't want to be part of our children's lives after everything that's happened, but I want you to know that when they're old enough to understand, I'm going to tell them about their grandfather who loved this place so much that he made sure it would be protected forever. I'm going to make sure they know that some things are too important to own. After she left, I sat on the front porch as evening approached, watching the lake change color as the sun moved lower in the western sky. The water went from blue to silver to gold, the same progression it had followed every day for millions of years, indifferent to human ambitions and family dramas. A loon called from somewhere across the lake, its voice wild and lonely. Linda had loved that sound, had said it reminded her that some things remained constant, even when everything else changed around them. Tonight it sounded less lonely than peaceful, like a benediction on decisions made and consequences accepted. The conservation battle was over. The legal challenges would come and fail, the family relationships would remain fractured, and the property would pass eventually to people who would care for it without trying to possess it. But for now, in the quiet space between one day and the next, I sat in a place that would remain exactly as it was, protected by law and memory, and the kind of love that gives freely without expecting returns. Tomorrow would bring new routines, new purposes, new ways of understanding what home meant when it belonged to everyone and no one. But tonight, I was exactly where I belonged, surrounded by the life Linda and I had created and the choices that would ensure it lasted long after we were both gone. The grandfather clock chimed 8 times as darkness settled over the lake. Somewhere in the distance, a screen door closed and a dog barked, and life continued its ordinary progression, unmarked by the quiet revolution that had just concluded on the shores of Clear Lake. I had won, though victory felt nothing like I'd expected. It felt like peace. 6 months after the wedding, I woke to the sound of rain on the roof, and the particular silence that comes with September mornings when summer is finally admitting defeat. The coffee tasted different now, not better or worse, but changed in the way familiar things change when the context around them shifts. I was no longer the owner of this house, but its custodian, no longer responsible for its future, but trusted with its present. The change had been subtle at first, barely noticeable in the day-to-day routines of making coffee and reading the paper and watching the lake change with the weather. But gradually, I'd begun to understand what it meant to live in a place without the weight of ownership, without the constant calculations of maintenance costs and property values, and what would happen to it all when I was gone. It meant freedom, though not the kind I'd expected. Jennifer Walsh from the Conservancy had stopped by the previous week to discuss the preliminary plans for the nature center that would eventually occupy the house. Nothing would change during my lifetime, she'd assured me, but they liked to plan ahead, to understand how the space might be used to educate visitors about watershed ecology and the importance of preserving critical habitat. This kitchen would make an excellent classroom, she'd said, gesturing toward the windows that framed the lake view. Imagine children sitting around this table, learning about the life cycles of fish and birds, understanding why places like this matter. I'd tried to imagine it. Young faces where Michael's had once been, eager questions instead of sullen teenage silence. The kind of wonder about the natural world that Linda had tried to nurture in our son, before he'd decided there were more important things to learn. The image was surprisingly comforting. The legal challenges had materialized as Marcus had predicted, filed by Morrison, Kellerman, and Associates with great fanfare, and abandoned quietly when it became clear they had no grounds for overturning a thoroughly documented charitable donation made by a mentally competent adult. William Morrison had made threatening phone calls for several weeks, his voice tight with the frustration of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation, before apparently being advised by more sensible counsel that he was wasting his money and his time. Michael hadn't called since that morning after the wedding. No birthday wishes in July, no holiday greetings, no updates about Sarah's pregnancy or their new life together. The silence was absolute, the kind that develops between people who've said everything there is to say and discovered it wasn't enough to bridge the gap between who they'd become and who they'd once been. I missed him, but not in the way I'd expected. I missed the boy he'd been more than the man he'd become, missed the relationship we'd never quite managed to build, rather than the one we'd actually had. The grief was cleaner that way, uncomplicated by anger or disappointment, just the simple sadness of paths not taken, and love that had somehow gotten lost in the complexity of growing up and growing apart. The morning mail brought a letter that changed the texture of my solitude, not from Michael, but about him. The envelope was addressed in careful handwriting I didn't recognize, postmarked from Albany. Inside, a single sheet of paper with a brief note. Mr. Patterson, you don't know me, but I'm Jennifer Walsh's sister. I work at Albany Medical Center, and I wanted you to know that your son and daughter-in-law had their baby last week. A girl, healthy and beautiful. They named her Linda. I know there are complications in your family, and I don't pretend to understand them. But I thought you should know that you have a granddaughter who carries your wife's name. With respect, Mary Walsh, RN. I read the letter 3 times, each reading bringing different emotions. Joy at the news of a healthy birth, sadness at learning it from a stranger, confusion about the choice to use Linda's name for a child I would probably never meet, and underneath it all, a complicated gratitude toward Mary Walsh for thinking an estranged grandfather deserved to know. I walked to Linda's photograph on the mantelpiece, the one taken that golden evening by the lake, when we were still young enough to believe love conquered everything. Her smile seemed different today, knowing there was a baby girl carrying her name into a future we'd never imagined. What do you think about that? I asked her image. A great-granddaughter named Linda, growing up with people who think we were too simple to understand the complexities of modern life. The photograph, of course, didn't answer. But I could imagine what she might say if she could. Something about how names carried forward the best parts of people, how children had a way of healing wounds their parents had created, how grandparents sometimes got second chances to love more wisely than they'd managed the first time around. The rain continued through the afternoon, the kind of steady precipitation that brought out the colors in the autumn leaves and made the lake look like brushed pewter. I spent the day doing small tasks, organizing Linda's recipes, sorting through old files, winterizing the dock for another season. Maintenance work that felt different now that I was caring for something temporarily rather than permanently, like tending a garden that would outlast me. Around 4 o'clock, I was in the garage when I heard tires on gravel. Not the aggressive arrival of someone seeking confrontation, but the careful approach of a visitor uncertain of their welcome. Through the window, I saw a modest sedan, not expensive but well-maintained, with a woman behind the wheel who sat for several minutes before getting out. Sarah emerged slowly, moving with the careful deliberation of someone still recovering from childbirth. She wore simple clothes, jeans and a sweater that looked comfortable rather than fashionable, and carried herself with a new kind of gravity that parenthood brings to young faces. In her arms, wrapped in a pink blanket, was the smallest person I'd ever seen. I met them on the porch, not sure what protocol governed meetings between estranged grandfathers and newborn granddaughters. Sarah looked up at me with an expression that mixed hope with uncertainty, like someone offering a truce without knowing if it would be accepted. "Mr. Patterson, I hope it's all right that I came. I know Michael wouldn't approve, but I thought—" She adjusted the blanket, revealing a tiny face that was sleeping with the profound peace that only babies manage. "I thought you should meet your granddaughter." The baby was perfect in the way all healthy newborns are perfect. Impossibly small fingers, delicate features that could have belonged to either parent, dark hair that might change color as she grew. When she opened her eyes for a moment, they were the deep blue that most babies are born with, wide and unfocused, and completely trusting. "Her name is Linda," Sarah said quietly, "after your wife. Michael said she would have wanted children to love this place the way he did when he was young." I reached out carefully, touching one tiny fist with my index finger. Her grip was surprisingly strong, the kind of reflexive hold that speaks to something deeper than conscious thought. "She's beautiful," I said, meaning it more than I'd meant anything in months. "Would you like to hold her?" I hadn't held a baby in 37 years, not since Michael was small enough to sleep in my arms while Linda made dinner or folded laundry. But muscle memory is a powerful thing, and somehow my body remembered the angle of arms that cradle without constraining, the gentle sway that soothes without disturbing. Little Linda felt weightless and substantial at the same time, warm through her blanket, breathing with the steady rhythm that makes adults lower their voices and move more carefully. She smelled like baby powder and possibility, like a future that hadn't yet been limited by other people's expectations or disappointments. "Why did you come?" I asked Sarah, as we settled into the porch chairs, the baby content to sleep in my arms while her mother watched with the vigilance of new parents everywhere. "Because she deserves to know her grandfather, because Michael is being stubborn and proud, and I think he's making a mistake he'll regret for the rest of his life." Sarah tucked her hair behind her ears, a gesture that made her look younger than her 28 years. "And because you were right about building something of our own. We bought a small house in Schenectady, and Michael left his firm to start his own practice. It's scary and exciting and hard work, and I wanted Linda to meet the man who taught us we were capable of it." We sat in comfortable silence, watching the rain create concentric circles on the lake's surface while the baby slept between generations that had found their way to an understanding neither had expected. The afternoon light was soft and gray, the kind that makes autumn afternoons feel timeless and peaceful. "Does Michael know you're here?" I asked finally. "He knows. He didn't try to stop me, but he didn't encourage it either. I think he's still too hurt and embarrassed to reach out himself, but he's not ready to cut you out of Linda's life completely." "And you?" Sarah smiled, the first genuinely happy expression I'd seen from her since the engagement party. "I grew up with everything handed to me, never having to earn anything or prove myself, or wonder if I was capable of more than spending other people's money. These past 6 months have been the hardest of my life, and also the best. I understand now why you wouldn't just give us what we wanted." The baby stirred in my arms, making small sounds that weren't quite crying but suggested she was thinking about it. Sarah reached for her, settling her against her shoulder with practiced movements that spoke to sleepless nights and steep learning curves and the particular exhaustion that comes with loving someone more than you knew was possible. "I should go," she said. "She'll want to eat soon, and the drive back is long when you're operating on 3 hours of sleep." As they prepared to leave, Sarah turned back from the car. "Mr. Patterson, I know this is complicated and I don't expect anything to change overnight, but would it be all right if I brought her to visit sometimes? Not often, not in any way that pressures you or Michael. Just occasionally, so she can know this place exists, so she can understand why some things are worth protecting." I thought about the nature center that would eventually replace me in this house, about children learning around the kitchen table where Michael had once done homework, about young faces discovering the same sense of wonder that Linda had tried to nurture in our son. "I'd like that," I said. "Linda would have liked that too." After they left, I sat on the porch until dark, thinking about the small weight of new life in my arms and the way hope could arrive unexpectedly, wearing a pink blanket and carrying a name that connected past to future in ways that transcended property transfers and family disputes. The evening brought a different kind of visitor. Not a person, but a memory that felt as real as physical presence. I was washing dinner dishes when I heard Linda's voice, clear and amused, coming from the living room, where she used to sit with her knitting while I cleaned up after our meals. "Well," she said, though when I turned there was no one there, "that went better than expected." I dried my hands and walked to her chair, running my fingers along the fabric that still held the faint scent of her perfume after 3 years. "You think she'll bring the baby back?" I think Sarah's learned something her husband is still too proud to figure out, that love isn't about what you can take from people, but what you're willing to give them. And Michael? He'll come around eventually, or he won't, but that little girl will grow up knowing her grandfather loved her before he even met her, and that's worth something. The conversation was imagination, of course, the kind of internal dialogue that helps people process decisions and cope with solitude. But it felt real enough, comforting enough, true enough to the woman Linda had been and the wisdom she'd carried through 47 years of marriage and parenthood. That night, I called Marcus to update my will. Nothing dramatic, just a provision that would establish a small trust fund for little Linda's education, funded by the life insurance policy that no longer needed to preserve the house for family inheritance. If Sarah kept her promise to visit, if the baby grew up knowing this place and understanding why it mattered, then she deserved to have choices about her own future that weren't limited by her parents' financial struggles. "Making peace with the next generation?" Marcus asked when I explained what I wanted. "Making sure she has options. Whether she uses them or not is up to her." Fall settled into winter with the kind of gradual transition that makes you forget summer ever existed. The lake developed its rim of ice, the trees stood bare against gray skies, and the house took on the particular silence of cold weather and shortened days. But it felt different this year, not empty, but expectant, like a theater between acts when the next scene is about to begin. Sarah kept her promise, bringing little Linda for visits every few weeks. I watched the baby grow from a sleeping bundle into someone with opinions about being held, about the temperature of bottles, about whether the grandfather clock was friend or foe. She smiled at 8 weeks, laughed at 12, and by Christmas was old enough to be fascinated by the colored lights Linda and I had strung around the living room windows for 37 consecutive years. Michael never came with them, but his presence was felt in the questions Sarah asked about his childhood, the way she pointed out things he'd told her about, the dock where he'd learned to fish, the tree where his old tire swing had hung, the corner of the garage where he'd built a workshop when he was 16 and full of plans for projects that would change the world. "He misses you," she said during one February visit, bouncing Linda on her knee while snow fell outside the windows. "He won't admit it, but he talks about you all the time. Stories about things you taught him, places you went together, ways you solved problems when he was growing up." Then why doesn't he call? Pride and guilt. He knows he handled everything wrong, knows he let my family push him into treating you like a problem instead of his father, but he doesn't know how to apologize for something that hurt you that much. I understood the feeling. There were more words that, once spoken, carved channels too deep to cross again. Michael had looked at me across a country club dining table and seen an asset requiring management. I had looked at him during his wedding reception and delivered news that destroyed his financial future. Some wounds might heal, but they left scars that served as permanent reminders of how much damage love could do when it forgot to include respect. Spring came early that year, ice breaking up in March instead of April, crocuses pushing through snow that hadn't quite decided to give up. The Conservancy sent a team to begin preliminary surveys for the Nature Center. Quiet professionals who measured and photographed and took notes about how to preserve the essential character of the place while making it accessible to visitors. I found their presence comforting rather than intrusive. They understood why this place mattered, appreciated its beauty without wanting to possess it, asked thoughtful questions about the history Linda and I had shared here. When they were finished, the property would still look like the home we'd created, but it would belong to everyone and no one, protected by law and public trust rather than by the temporary stewardship of private ownership. One afternoon in April, as I was working in Linda's garden, planting the tulips and daffodils she would have chosen, I heard a car in the driveway. Not Sarah's modest sedan, but something I recognized from memory rather than recent experience. Michael's BMW, parked carefully beside the house where it had sat so many times during his childhood and adolescence. He emerged slowly, like someone approaching a door they weren't sure would open for them. He looked older than his 37 years, tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep and everything to do with carrying weight you couldn't put down. His clothes were simpler than I remembered, good quality but not ostentatious, the wardrobe of a man who'd learned the difference between having money and spending it. We stood looking at each other across the driveway for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. Two men who shared a history, but no longer shared a present, trying to figure out what, if anything, they still shared besides blood and memory. "Dad," he said finally, the word carrying more weight than its single syllable could reasonably bear. "Michael." I was hoping we could talk. I gestured toward the porch where two chairs waited, the same chairs where Linda and I had shared morning coffee and evening conversations for decades. Michael climbed the steps slowly, settling into the chair she'd preferred, while I took my usual place with a view of the lake. "Sarah told me she's been bringing Linda to visit." "She has. She's a good mother. You're lucky." "I know." He was quiet for a moment, staring out at the lake where afternoon light danced on water that was finally free of ice. "She's also been telling me what an idiot I am for staying away, for letting pride keep me from apologizing to the father who raised me better than this." "Did she now?" "Every visit, apparently, along with stories about how patient and kind you are with the baby, how you've been putting money aside for her education, how you talk about me like you still love me despite everything I did." The conversation felt fragile, like something that might shatter if either of us pushed too hard or demanded too much. But there was something different in Michael's voice, something that hadn't been there during our last encounter. Humility, maybe, or simply exhaustion with carrying anger that had nowhere useful to go. "I do love you," I said quietly. "I always have, even when I haven't liked you very much." He smiled at that, the first genuinely happy expression I'd seen from him since he was a teenager. That's what parents are supposed to do, isn't it? Love their children, even when their children are acting like spoiled brats who think they know better than everyone else. Pretty much. We sat in comfortable silence, watching the lake and the birds and the late afternoon light that made everything look softer around the edges. Finally, Michael spoke again, his voice careful but determined. "I'm sorry, Dad, for all of it. For treating you like you were incompetent, for letting the Morrisons manipulate me into thinking I knew what was best for you, for seeing this place as property instead of home. I'm sorry for being the kind of son who forgot that respect comes before inheritance, who thought love meant control instead of trust." The apology settled between us like a bridge, not quite spanning the distance, but offering a path across it for those willing to make the effort. "I'm sorry too," I said, "for the way I told you about the conservation donation, for letting anger guide my choices instead of trying harder to help you understand, for giving up on us before we'd really tried to work things out." "Are we working things out now?" I considered the question, looking at my son in the chair where his mother had once sat, his daughter's grandfather in the chair where her great-grandfather had once planned and worried and hoped, 3 generations removed from each other by choices and circumstances and the particular pride that makes it hard to admit you were wrong. "We're trying," I said finally. "That's something." Michael stayed for dinner, nothing fancy, just the kind of simple meal Linda would have made when he was young and always hungry and full of stories about school and friends and plans for summer adventures. We talked about his new business, Sarah's adjustment to motherhood, little Linda's personality and preferences, and the way she seemed to study faces like she was memorizing them for future reference. As he prepared to leave, Michael paused at the door. "Dad, would it be all right if I came back sometime? Not to argue about the house or the conservancy or any of that. That's done, and honestly, I think you made the right choice. Just to visit, to spend time together, to let Linda get to know her grandfather. I'd like that. And maybe," he hesitated, then continued with the kind of courage it takes to risk disappointment. "Maybe you'd like to come visit us sometime, see our house, meet our friends, be part of Linda's life in the place where she's growing up." The invitation surprised me, not because it was unwelcome, but because it represented a shift in our relationship I hadn't expected. Michael asking me to be part of his life rather than trying to manage mine, offering inclusion rather than demanding compliance. I'd like that too. After he left, I sat on the porch until full dark, thinking about second chances and the particular grace that lets people start over without forgetting what they've learned from getting it wrong the first time. The lake was quiet except for the gentle lap of waves against the dock, and somewhere in the distance a loon called, the same wild, lonely sound that had provided the soundtrack for 40 years of mornings and evenings in this place. But tonight it sounded less lonely than peaceful, like a benediction on decisions made and relationships mended, and the kind of hope that grows stronger when you stop trying to control it. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times as I came inside, marking another day in a life that had found its rhythm again after months of discord and uncertainty. Tomorrow would bring new routines, new possibilities, new ways of understanding what family meant when it was based on choice rather than obligation, love rather than law, respect rather than inheritance. I had lost a son and found him again, not as the man I'd tried to raise, but as the man he'd chosen to become, after learning that some lessons can only be taught by consequences. I had gained a granddaughter whose smile reminded me that hope comes in the smallest packages, carrying the biggest promises. And I had kept the place Linda and I had loved, not by holding on to it, but by letting it go to people who would protect it forever, exactly as it was, exactly as it should be. The house settled around me with its familiar sounds, the tick of the clock, the creak of old wood, the whisper of wind through trees that would outlast us all. But for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't alone in it. I was surrounded by the presence of people who mattered. Linda, in every carefully chosen detail. Michael, in every childhood memory these rooms contained. Little Linda, in every possibility the future held. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything a man could reasonably ask for, from a life well lived, a love well shared, and a legacy that would endure long after the people who created it had become part of the landscape they'd chosen to protect. Outside, the protected lake reflected stars that had witnessed everything human hearts could do to each other, and somehow, miraculously, endured it all. In the final years of his life, Richard Patterson became a beloved figure at the Finger Lakes Land Conservancy, sharing stories about the property's history with visitors who came to learn about watershed ecology and the importance of preserving critical habitat. His granddaughter Linda grew up knowing the lake as a place of wonder and protection, eventually studying environmental science and carrying forward the values her great-grandmother had cherished and her grandfather had fought to preserve. The house still stands on the shores of Clear Lake, now serving as an education center where children learn that some things are too important to own, too precious to possess, and too beautiful to keep to yourself. On quiet mornings when mist rises from the water, visitors sometimes report hearing the distant sound of a grandfather clock, ticking away time in rooms that remember love, witness forgiveness, and shelter the hope that every ending can also be a beginning.